On a remote Michigan farm, a strange ritual repeats. The lean German shepherd ignores food, sleep, even the pain of raw paws, to dig the same patch of earth, hour after hour, day after day. This isn't play. The focus in those eyes is military, a silent alarm only one person hears. Jack Monroe, 50, a former volunteer rescuer, watches once, twice, then grabs the tool that never lied to him, an old metal detector. He sweeps the coil over the torn ground, and a piercing tone slams into his headphones. Steady, unbroken, meaning something huge is buried beneath their feet. What is it? Stay with us. If this story grabs you, subscribe. The last miles into Michigan's Upper Peninsula felt like a conversation with winter. The sky wore a pewter lid. Wind off Lake Superior threaded through birch and pine like a cold needle, and the gravel lane drummed steadily beneath the tires of a powder blue pickup that had done more years than anyone had asked of it. Jack Monroe drove with both hands easy on the wheel, the posture of a man who understood that control was equal parts grip and surrender. He was 50, tall and spare, with square shoulders and a narrow waist, the kind of lean that comes from practical work, hauling, lifting, building, not chasing a number on a screen. A day's salt and pepper stubble softened a jaw that could look stubborn if you caught it wrong. His hands were work-scarred, small white lines across the knuckles, a half-moon nick at the base of the thumb where a stubborn bolt had slipped, and his eyes were the steady brown of coffee kept warm a little too long. Gentle when they could be, unblinking when they had to. Years as a volunteer had carved that steadiness into him. Sandbagging swollen rivers in Iowa, unloading pallets of bottled water in coastal heat that smelled like salt and sheet metal, standing outside church basement shelters during western fire seasons, while smoke turned sunsets to copper. He had learned how to be useful without being loud, kind without being careless, present without making it about himself. And somewhere along the way, after one too many nights of sirens and generator hum, he had learned how to crave quiet like a food group. The farmhouse waited at the end of a ribbon of ruts, 2 stories of clapboard gone gray, a porch that sagged like a tired smile, a chimney of riverstone leaning a degree off true. A red barn listed beside it, roof dip like a nod from an old man you don't quite know yet. 40 acres of scrubby meadow reached a wall of young birches and dark pines, and beyond that the tight weave of forest where wind spoke in a lower voice. Jack cut the ignition and let the silence arrive the way weather does. Not all at once, but then it is simply there. Cold found the seams of his jacket and flannel and pressed a flat palm to his ribs. He drew a breath that tasted of wood smoke and damp earth, the smell of places that can still fix themselves if you let them. He walked the place the way he always walked a new site. Slow, hands free, eyes soft so they could see more. The porch steps complained but held. A kitchen window pane showed a spider crack and a draft that lifted the corner of an old calendar. The barn roof wanted patches before any real snow. The east wall asked for a brace. In his head, a list began writing itself, and with it came a quiet he trusted. Lists were rooms you could live inside. Work was a door you could close on the weather in your mind. He carried in a coffee can of nails and a bundle of folded maps, set a dented percolator on the counter, and laughed once at the way his breath showed in the kitchen. That laugh, small, private, felt like a good sign. Movement at the tree line turned him. It belonged to creatures that prefer not to be seen, a slip between one stillness and the next. A dog stood where meadow met pine, the silhouette unmistakable even in flat afternoon light. A German shepherd, large but thin enough that the geometry of ribs showed where a dense winter coat should have hidden them. charcoal and cream colored, a darker ruff around the neck, legs muddied. One ear carried a small nick along the rim, the old half-moon scar that marks a life not spent entirely indoors. Its posture read restraint wrapped around vigilance. The head was high, the ears forward, but the weight sat back on its hips in the careful balance of an animal that had paid for mistakes before. Even at distance, he thought the paw pads looked raw around the edges, red showing through mud like letters bleeding through thin paper. Jack did not call to it. Volunteers learn early that wanting to help and actually helping are two different verbs. He didn't whistle, didn't kiss air, didn't make the small, coaxing sounds people use when they're trying to fill their own silence. He nodded once, the way you nod to a neighbor across a fence when you mean, "I see you, and I am not a problem," and let his hand stay in plain sight. The dog did not move. It blinked once, slow, the way tired lookouts refuse to close their eyes. The sky dimmed a notch toward evening. Jack brought in 2 more boxes, wiped his boots, then returned to the porch with a bucket and a rag to wipe road dust from the kitchen window. When he looked up, the dog was still there, fixed to the dark seam between field and woods, like it had been set there by a careful hand. A person can pretend not to notice something that asks nothing of them, but Jack had lost the habit of pretending. He rinsed an old enamel bowl at the pump until the water ran glass clear and biting cold. From a crate he took a can of plain chicken and rice, the shelf-stable kind kept in stacks for tornado months, and eased it into a second bowl. He set both dishes on the bottom step with the same care he set down tools that mattered, then backed up to the top tread and sat, forearms on his knees, gaze on the field as if nothing in particular required attention. He remembered a doorway in Louisiana where he'd learned a thing that never stopped being true. Respect is relief all by itself. Give space, be steady, don't reach fast. Dusk gathered like a habit. A scrap of pale sky died behind the western trees. A single early star tried and failed against thickening cloud. Jack's breath made thin, pale ribbons that faded as the wind took them apart. The dog shifted its weight like a reader turning a page they weren't sure about yet, listened past porch and house to something small in the woods, then stepped from the tree line with the measured caution of a creature that had learned both economy and consequences. It came to the tall grass at the yard's edge and stopped to scent the air, body angled for both view and escape. After a long minute, it advanced in a slow arc that gave the porch a respectful berth. Jack kept his eyes soft, resting them on the pale line of a birch trunk, counting the knuckles in the bark, and the ghosty flutter of last leaves clinging to the high twigs. The dog reached the bowls and went to water first, as sensible creatures do in cold places. 2 long, careful drinks, each swallow a choice. Then a pause, nose to air, a checking of lines, and a measured mouthful of food. No desperate scarfing, no sound beyond quiet crunch. Method, not hurry. Wary patience, the way a soldier eats upright. After half the portion, the dog slid back into the grass and lay with its body angled so it could see him sideways and still keep the trees in its periphery. Distance preserved. Options open. Jack let air leave his lungs and didn't replace it for a slow count of 4, then filled himself again, something in his chest settling, as if a small gear had finally clicked into the right tooth. After a while, he stood, went inside, and clicked on a yellow lamp that civilized the edges of the kitchen. He filled the percolator and set it on the coil. When the first thin steam rose, it braided into the breath he'd been carrying since morning and made him feel, for the first time that day, present in one place. In the city he had left behind, sirens ran under everything like a water line, Alley wind raised dust that tasted like metal. Elevators smelled faintly of burnt dust and tired carpet. He still saw faces with inconvenient clarity. A boy carefully carrying his grandmother's framed photo through a shelter crowd. A woman with ash on her cheeks, and a stray cat zipped into her sweatshirt like a secret. A tired school custodian who opened the gym doors during a blackout and just said, "Come in." Those moments shaped the way he stood now. Quiet, squared, willing to let the world arrive before naming it. At the door again, he found the dog a darker shape against dark grass, the white rim of the water dish a small moon by its paws. Snow smell had come stronger, a clean metallic promise you can almost see in the air. The porch boards popped as the temperature fell, and the house gave its little old bones creaks, the voices by which a place introduces itself to a new inhabitant. He turned off the lamp and let the night own the yard. The dog lifted its head once, as if answering a roll call, then lowered it again to lay its muzzle on its forelegs. The ears stayed high. Jack slept lightly, the way men sleep when they don't yet trust a house. Once, at a sound he couldn't name, he lay with eyes open until the quiet proved itself again. Before sleep took him the second time, he thought of the decision that had nudged him north. He'd been standing by a shelter door, directing traffic gently with a palm. A young woman had arrived with a child on one hip, and a hard-case violin in the other hand, and a truck driver behind her had stepped forward unasked and taken the case with the care you give a living thing. In that small exchange, no speech, just a hand and a nod, the noise in Jack's ribs had stood down. Silence can be many things. He wanted the kind that teaches you how to listen. Morning slid into the rooms as gray as dishwater. No fanfare. He shrugged into boots and jacket and stepped onto the porch. Ice traced a lace along the water bowl's rim, delicate as handwriting. The food was half gone, the rest a calmly made choice. At the meadow's mouth, the dog stood where it had stood the day before. Same distance, same long, listening posture. Frost had combed its coat. He thought the rawness at the paw edges would sting in this air, and felt a sympathetic wince in his own hands. He rinsed the bowls, the ice giving way with a brittle music, refilled them, and set them in the same place. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for trust. Trust arrives when no one asks it to hurry. The dog did not come closer, and it did not leave. That was enough. Wind pushed through the pines in a long hush like surf a county away. Jack rubbed his palms together and thought through the order of the day. Patch the roof while the light held, shore the porch posts after, walk the barn's east wall before dusk. He felt the plan assemble itself around him the way a frame rises around a foundation. At the forest's edge, the shepherd watched, thin and alert, a sentinel set just inside the tree line. Jack lifted the pickup's toolbox lid, found the heavier gloves he'd been looking for, and turned back toward the house. The forest held its breath. The dog watched, and between the two of them, in the honest air of a cold morning, a small, wordless agreement took hold. You keep your distance, I'll keep mine, and we will both be here tomorrow. Morning arrived in a flat gray that made the paddocks look older than they were, a breath like cold tin on the air, and the birches along the fence line trembling just enough to show where the wind pushed through. Jack Monroe stepped onto the porch with a steaming cuppa and the same quiet he'd brought to every long day of work he'd ever done. The water bowl he'd left out wore a brittle lace of ice, and the food dish was nudged a handspan from where he'd set it. A small movement that meant the night had hosted a cautious meal. Out in the field, where the meadow shouldered up against the darker shoulder of the pines, the shepherd stood again as if it had held that line all night. Up close, the animal's lines read differently than they had in dusk. 3 to 4 years old by the look of the jaw and the steadiness of the stance. A big dog, but spare just now. Charcoal saddle fading to cream along the ribs and down the legs. That small nick on the left ear like a comma in the sentence of its life. It had the look you see in old stockmen and good firefighters, the patient readiness of creatures who've learned that the next 10 seconds matter more than the last 1,000 words. Jack set fresh water, a new bowl of food, and let the quiet of the place talk for him. He spent the first hours on the barn roof, working in rubber-soled boots that would do for gumboots if the weather turned wet, stripping back a run of warped shingles and laying down a tidy path of new ones. He kept his head down, because roofs want that, but his attention walked the boundary of the yard the way a dog does, returning again and again to the same square of meadow where movement turned the grass to a darker green. By mid-morning the shepherd had left the tree line and was in the field, exactly 100 paces from the porch by Jack's count. It stood over a patch thick with clover and weed and began to work the earth like a creature paying off an old debt. There was no mad scramble in it. This was disciplined labor, a neat rhythm of forelegs cutting, paws scooping, body weight shifting back to throw dirt just far enough to keep the hole clean. Every minute or two the dog would pause, lift its head, and scent the air, then return to the same spot, reshaping the ground as if it were erasing a mistake only it could see. Jack watched between motions on the roof, a nail between his lips, and felt a small, unwelcome pinch somewhere under the breastbone. He had seen that kind of focus on flood levees when a man with a shovel found a seep and refused to leave it until someone with a truckload of sandbags arrived. He had seen it in a teenage girl kneeling on a supermarket lino floor during a blackout, counting breaths with a stranger as if each number could pull oxygen out of the dark. You learn to honor focus like that. You also learn to worry when it's eating someone alive. At 11 he climbed down for a breather, hands stiff from dry cold, and topped up the bowls again. The dog ignored them. The way a person lost in a job they didn't choose will ignore the clock. It dug until the first skin wore from the edges of the paw pads, and a wet shine showed through the mud, then shifted its weight to relieve the sting, and kept going. The pace did not quicken, and did not flag. It just continued. "All right, mate," Jack said under his breath. Not a call-out, just a sentence you say to the day. He fetched a pair of old binoculars from a crate in the kitchen, glass scratched from years of glove-box rides, and watched from the shadow of the porch post so he wouldn't crowd the animal with his stare. The hole was not a crater. It was a disciplined, narrow dig, widening only as the sides caved and needed to be squared, the work of an animal that wasn't simply chasing a scent that moved. The shepherd's head angled not left-right like a dog tracking with eyes alone, but up-down, as if the information lived in vertical lines. Around midday, the wind shifted and brought a sting from the lake, along with the faint metallic smell that tells you weather is changing gears. Jack put another patch on the roof and came down for a sandwich eaten one-handed, while the other hand held a pair of pliers that had warmed nicely in his pocket. He shifted the old enamel bowl a bit farther from the step, so the dog wouldn't have to cross the invisible line either of them had drawn. He did not try to shorten the distance. One of the few certain lessons he'd taken out of chaotic places was that forcing closeness is just aggression wearing a friendly shirt. The dog kept to its square of earth as the sun moved and shadows got blunt. When it did step away, it went only far enough to stand with its sides heaving, taking air in heavy, careful draws the way runners do when they train to measure out pain. It walked to the water, lapped like an animal that remembers thirst and respects it, then returned to the hole without a pause at the food. Jack felt the urge to act, go down there with a rope and a calm voice, clear the dog off its own compulsion, make it rest. But you don't get to be useful by putting your own discomfort at the center of the room. He went to the barn instead, and opened the long olive-drab footlocker he hadn't lifted the lid on since spring. The hinges complained and then gave, and the barn's cold breath came up around him smelling of old hay and dry dirt, and that ghost of oil that never truly leaves machines. Under a folded tarp, wrapped in a towel that had once been white, lay a metal detector he'd borrowed so often on deployments that he'd finally bought one of his own. A serious unit with a round coil, telescoping shaft, a control box that still bore a scuff from a day on a washed-out car park when someone knocked it off a card table with a panicked elbow. It wasn't a beachcomber's toy. He'd used this sort of kit before when he'd been the bloke kneeling by a collapsed veranda, mapping nails versus something you don't want to put a shovel through. He lifted it with both hands, like you do when you remember that tools are just partners that only ever ask you to hold up your end. He checked the batteries, found he had enough juice to run a proper ground balance, and thumbed the toggle. The control box built its little hum until it became a steady bed of sound you could walk a paddock on. He swung the coil in a slow, even arc the way he'd been taught by a man with a voice like gravel and a patience that could outwait weather. Over the barn threshold, chatter from nails. Across the compacted yard, an occasional bright chirp for old wire. Near the battered fence post, flat tone from a hinge somebody had dropped and let go of years ago. Good. The language was still there in his hands. He wrapped the detector down again and set it by the door, propping the shaft against a crate of roofing nails. He wasn't taking it out to the hole yet. Not while the dog's work had the fierce center it had. He knew from experience that tools change rooms, and right now the paddock was the dog's room. Instead, he found an old tin of barrier cream he'd used on cracked knuckles in dry winters and set it near the door where he wouldn't forget it. The small plan forming that if the animal let him close enough, tomorrow, the next day, some day, he'd lay a thin smear across those pads and take whatever backlash a proud creature gave him for interfering. He looked again through the binoculars and saw the first bead of red set into mud like a berry. "You stubborn beauty," he said, and had the odd, precise knowledge that he meant both words. The afternoon wore on. The shepherd dug until the patch of earth looked like a square wound in the green. Now and then it stilled, ears forward, as if it could hear something in the ground that didn't make noise. Jack tried not to guess and failed. He thought of roots and buried junk and the long, half-true stories that stick to old farms like burrs. When the light silvered toward evening, the dog stopped for the first time and lifted its nose to the wind in a way that said the day had done what it could. It walked to the water bowl with the careful gait of someone stepping off a ladder rung by rung after a long roof job, drank, then lay in the grass within sight of the hole, chin on forepaws, eyes still open. Jack stepped down from the porch and went only as far as the third flagstone. He kept his hands low and easy, body angled not at the dog but a little to the side the way you stand for a nervous horse. "You look like a scout," he said, not a christening so much as a recognition, and the new name fit in the air without a bump. The dog's ears tipped and then settled, a response so small most people would have missed it, which might be why the world so often goes wrong. He let the shape of the day end itself. He went inside, wrote 3 lines on a scrap. Roof east half-patched. Dog dug same square all day. Detector ready. And tucked it under a clip on the fridge door because lists keep their own kind of weather, and he'd learned to respect that too. The wind came up after sunset, a long, patient push from the lake that pressed the eaves and set the birch leaves to their last whisper. Somewhere in the woods a branch cracked like a shot, and then all the dark settled back into itself. Jack lay on the couch for a while, with his boots off, and the soft pop of the old timber keeping him company, eyes open to the ceiling until the day let him go. When he woke in the night to use the loo, he stood at the window for a minute and watched the field in the kind of starlight that comes only when the cold has shouldered the clouds aside. The hole in the meadow was only a darker square, a subtraction you feel in the eye more than you see. The dog was a darker shadow near it, the same line, the same duty, keeping the kind of watch that no one asks for and that can't be easily refused. Before dawn, he pulled on a jumper over his flannel and stepped out with water that smoked in the bowl. He walked a slow arc that brought him a few meters nearer to the work without breaking the unspoken rules, and he let his voice carry the sort of tone you use in the first minutes after a fire crew arrives. Low, specific, not interested in drama. "Good on you, Scout," he said. "We'll have a proper look soon." The detector waited by the barn door like a promise he hadn't made out loud yet. The day would come for it. For now, two stubborn creatures and a square of earth had agreed on a job, and Jack had learned enough to recognize a signal when he saw one. By mid-morning, the frost had lifted into a thin shine on the grass, and the paddock smelt like cold soil and pine sap. Jack Monroe brought the metal detector out from the barn, thumbed the toggle, and let the soft electronic hum settle in his ears. He wasn't looking to be a hero, just to be useful and fair dinkum about it. Scout stood 10 meters off the hole he'd carved into the clover, chest rising and falling, eyes pinned to that square of earth with the same quiet insistence he'd shown all week. Jack grounded the coil, ran a neat figure-8 to balance, then swung in slow, overlapping arcs the way an old instructor had drilled into him. Half a step, overlap, listen. Half a step, overlap, listen. Nails chattered near the fence line. A buried hinge bleeped near the old gate. And then, as the coil crossed the lip of Scout's dig, the headphones filled with a single, continuous tone that cut through everything else like a whistle on a winter oval, high, unwavering, a scream that didn't modulate or argue. He lifted the coil, and the tone vanished. He lowered it, and the scream returned, flat and absolute. "Righto," he murmured, more to the air than to the dog. Big target, flat face. Not the scatter of scrap, not the mean little pulse of wire. Scout tipped one ear as if to say, "Now you hear it too." Jack marked a rectangle around the hole with 4 stakes and twine, paced out clearances for a machine to work, and put the detector away. He'd done enough hard yakka with hand tools to know when to bring in a bigger bite. In town, the only hire yard sat on the edge of a light industrial strip, where every second sign promised tires, skids, or small engine repair. The counterman, Ron Rusty Calhoun, looked like he'd never taken a holiday from Greece. Late 50s, heavy through the chest and forearms, steel gray hair shoved under a faded cap, mustache too neat to be accidental. He had the temper of a bloke who'd seen 100 customers lie about fuel levels and bent teeth on augers, and the patience to sort them without shouting. His left ring finger wore a thin gold band polished by habit. The back of his right hand showed a pale crescent scar, old grinder kiss by the look of it. "Mini excavator for 2 days," Jack said. "I can pay up front. I'll need delivery. Track's rough." Rusty's eyes did a quick measure the way kit men do, from boots to jacket to hands, stopping a half-second on the nicks and calluses that tell you a customer isn't pretending. "Where to?" Jack gave him the road and the kilometer marker. Rusty whistled under his breath. "You and every hermit from here to the lake reckon you're the last bloke in the world," he said without malice. "All right, we'll sling it on a flatbed. Arvo drop okay?" Jack nodded. Rusty did the paperwork with tidy block letters, slid a yellow copy across. "Operator manual's in the cab. You break it fair and square, we'll sort it. You break it crook, you're paying." He didn't smile when he said it, which made it more like a handshake than a threat. The driver was May Rourke, mid-30s, wiry and sun-browned despite the cold, dark hair braided and shoved through the back of her cap, hands small but quick on binders. She had the brisk cheer of someone who likes machines because they don't talk back, and a laugh that came out of her nose more than her mouth. "You Jack?" "Righto," she said, boots crunching on the gravel of his track. "Where do you want the digger?" "Ground soft on your east side. Don't want to leave you with ruts big enough to lose a kid." He liked her immediately. They offloaded the yellow machine near the staked rectangle. May glanced at the shepherd standing off and lifted a hand, palm down, the universal move for calm. "Good-looking boy," she said. "Got that cop-dog posture. Don't see many strays hold a line like that." Jack said nothing about lines or why they get burned into any creature. May gave him a quick nod that said, "Say g'day to the quiet for me," and rattled off down the track. Jack eased the excavator to life. The diesel growl felt indecent in the paddock's hush, but sometimes noise is part of the honest work. He cut the bucket in shallow, shaving the edges of Scout's hole wide enough to stand in safely, stopping often to check walls, keeping the sides stepped like a proper trench so nothing slumped and took him with it. Scout retreated to the barn shade, head low, eyes never leaving the rectangle. At a depth that cooled the air against Jack's cheeks, the bucket's teeth snicked something that wasn't earth. He killed the engine at once. The silence landed with weight. He slid into the hole with a shovel, trading mass for care, and scraped away in slow, neat strokes. A color surfaced that had no business in soil, a chalky white under a skin of brown, then the hard line of red along its edge. He cleared until his gloved knuckles tapped metal, then wiped away clods with the back of his wrist. Letters emerged, tall, blocky, flaking but legible. A MBUL. He didn't need the rest to feel his stomach drop. Ambulance, 6 feet down in clover and weed. "Bloody hell," he said softly. Scout's breath puffed in small, measured clouds at the rim. There are moments you can feel the shape of the next hour curl toward you. Jack climbed out, fetched a crowbar and a short sledge, and went to the rear doors where he could feel the seam with his fingertips. The latch had long since surrendered to rust. The seam was a packed line of clay and time. He worked the bar in with taps that respected old metal, levered until the bar sang along its length, shifted, and tried again. The first internal pop sounded like a bone giving up. The right-hand door moved a few centimeters, enough for earth to spill like damp flour. He went for the torch, set it on a ledge and leaned in. Not cabinets, not gurney rails, not air. Dirt, tamped and tamped. Again, until it had become a wall. Whoever had done the job had filled the ambulance from the inside, not merely buried a box. That kind of labor tells you a story. Jack did not reach for the phone. He reached for a small entrenching tool from the footlocker and a heavy-duty mask from an old bushfire kit. He slid inside on one shoulder, working sideways in a space that pressed cold through jacket and denim. The first spade came back with the smell of earth shut away from seasons. He scooped and tossed, letting the dirt fall behind him. The torch made a hard circle of light, and the rest of the world vanished. The sound of the shovel biting, and his breath under the mask made a rhythm he could live inside. He worked methodically because panic has never once dug a cleaner inch. A soft resistance stopped the blade. Not metal, not stone. He shifted to bare hands, fingers walking through soil until they found the edge of something that had stitching once. Leather rotted to suede, a strap that parted like damp cake when he lifted it wrong. He adjusted, slid both hands beneath and brought up a nurse's bag the color of old coffee, seams blown, clasps fused with a rind of rust. On the buckled flap, a dull, cross-shaped shadow where a badge had been. He lay it by the door and returned to the cut. Next came a plastic case the size of a deck of cards, cloudy but intact, scratched as if keys had worried it for years. A thermometer case. Then a wallet. Men's, by its folded mundanity, stiff as a biscuit left too long in the tin. He wouldn't pick through it there. Some things you do at a table with both feet on the floor. He eased it aside and dug on. He found a single cufflink by feel, not sight. Weighty, cool, with a face that took a rub and shone unwillingly. He turned it in his palm. The engraved letters lay twined like a too familiar couple, F and C. He didn't have the energy for speculation, only the discipline to inventory. Last of the smalls was a micro-cassette recorder, the kind that used to live in journalists' pockets and the bottom drawers of reception desks, its little window showing twin spools locked in silent stubbornness. Battery compartment crusted, screws brown, casing grit-stained but uncracked. He placed it with the other items and leaned back in, ground now cleared through the halfway mark toward the cab. When his fingers read bone, he stopped moving because anything else would have been indecent. The hand lay in profile, phalanges neat as a diagram, a cuff of fabric fused to the wrist bone's memory. He pulled his hands back and sat with his knees pressed to the dirt where his chest could register the beat that meant he was still in the world of the living. For a long minute he didn't speak, not even to the silence. Scout made a sound above him, one low note that wasn't a whine and wasn't a growl, just the throat's acknowledgement of gravity. Jack eased himself out of the ambulance, turned off the torch, and let the day return in pieces. The sound of wind across birch buds, the creak of the barn timbers thinking about the afternoon's cool, the faint click of the excavator settling as metal eased its own heat. He set the bag, the wallet, the cufflink, and the recorder on a clean Hessian sack on the porch steps, then sat beside them because standing over things that belonged to the dead felt wrong. He didn't open anything yet. He just let the names he didn't have, and the story he hadn't earned, sit beside him. The sun had slid past the top of the pines before he reached for the wallet. It cracked open with the scrape of old leather parting from itself. Inside, under a fogged plastic window, a Michigan driver's license showed the ghost of a smiling young woman with light hair pulled back from a heart-shaped face and eyes with a kind of earned brightness. Sarah Hayes, the name said in tidy capitals. Issue year, 1993. The date lived in the photo's haircut and the font. There was a library card. The ink bled to softness. 2 folded notes that would buy you a coffee and not much else. And behind a flap, the single heavy cufflink's twin impression in the leather where it had been kept or pressed once. He put the license down with the gentleness you save for photos at wakes. He picked up the cufflink again and felt the prickle at the back of his neck. You get when coincidence stops looking innocent. FC. He looked at Scout, who had come up the steps at some point, and lay with his muzzle on his paws, eyes open, ears listening to whatever the wind was saying in the trees. "We'll call it in," Jack said, voice low and steady the way you do at crash sites and kitchen tables. "But first we keep our heads." He checked his hands. Soil sat in the cuticles, packed under the nails. A line of dry skin had opened along his thumb from the cold. He stood, washed up at the pump until the sting sharpened his thinking, dried on his shirt hem, and went back to the porch. He placed the recorder in his palm and turned it over. He didn't push any buttons. Not yet. Some doors you open once, and then everything is different. He looked out at the paddock and the neat, wrong rectangle in the green. He felt the weight of the air change the way rooms change, when a truth finally decides to arrive. Night moved across the fence line in a slow, unbothered way, and the cold sharpened. Jack stacked the items carefully, took them inside, and set them on a clean towel on the kitchen table. "Good on you, mate," he told Scout in the doorway. "You held your line." The dog blinked once and settled by the threshold, a silent sentry who had finally brought the right man to the right patch of ground. Jack spread a clean tea towel on the kitchen table and laid out the 4 items he'd carried up from the paddock. The coffee-brown nurse's bag with its seams blown wide, the stiff wallet with a fogged window, the heavy silver cufflink engraved with those intertwined letters, and the little micro-cassette recorder that looked too stubborn to die. The house had cooled as the sun slid behind the pines. The room held that end-of-day quiet where every sound has edges. He fetched a mug, poured a cuppa strong enough to stand a spoon, and set the recorder on its back under the lamp. The battery compartment was a cemetery of corrosion, powdery green, white crust on the springs. He worked like a bloke who has learned that haste only ever buys you mistakes. Cotton buds dipped in methylated spirits, a dental pick teasing oxide off the contacts, a soft paintbrush for the grit. Scout lay in the doorway in that half-sphinx posture that kept weight off sore pads, head up, eyes on, the lean of him saying he'd rest when the job did. Jack found 2 AA batteries at the back of a drawer, tested them on a torch, and fitted them in with a care that felt ceremonial. He pressed play. Nothing. He frowned, then held the button down and gave the recorder a firm rap against his palm, an old trick remembered from an ops tent where nothing worked until it did. The tiny spools shivered and began to turn, a thin whir under the kitchen's quiet. For a full minute there was only hiss, a soft river of static that made the room seem to breathe. Then a young woman's voice lifted out of it, bright, steady, American Midwest with vowels softened by kindness. October 3rd, 1995. Rain all day. Clinic was quiet. Mrs. Gable is feeling better. Thank God. Jack sat forward, forearms on the table, the way you do when a story finally starts telling itself. The entries came like postcards from the last days of a life. Weather, a film she'd liked because the hero didn't save the day by being cruel. The old man who brought chocolates to the nurses and counted each one like a prayer. Then a shift, almost too fine to hear if you hadn't been trained to feel when rooms change. October 10th. Frank brought me flowers again. He can be overwhelming. It's like he's generous to make a point. Sometimes he looks at me like I'm one of his investments. A short laugh. Not happy. I don't know why I'm saying this into a tape recorder. Maybe because paper is too easy to burn. Jack glanced at the cufflink. F and C lay against the tea towel, as if initials could be weight. The entries thinned, then came back with a new thread in the voice, something tight across the top of every word. October 17th. It's worse. He said I'm going to ruin him, that I don't understand what people like him can do. He told me to keep quiet and smile. He said he'd silence me if he had to. The next minute was breath and road noise. Jack felt his own breath go shallow and made it deepen because fear is a poor listener. The last entry began with the sound of tires on bitumen and a heater fan whining on a failing bearing. When she spoke, her words were a whisper torn off at the edges. October 22nd. He called. Said we had to meet and make it go away. He's in the car behind me. He told me to follow him to the old Blackwood shed. There's no one out here. I can see his headlights. I shouldn't have... Oh God, he's... The tape clicked like a door closing in the next room. Jack let the silence sit where it landed. Scout made a sound that wasn't a whine, wasn't a growl, just a small acknowledgement that something heavy had entered the house. Jack thumbed stop and set the recorder down as if he were putting back a fragile artifact in a museum. He stood, rinsed his hands at the sink because doing a simple right thing gives your nerves a fence to lean on, and on the way back past the dog, he reached without thinking to scratch the soft inside of an ear. His fingers paused. There, on the pale skin of the pinna, a faded set of blue-green characters ran like a half-remembered serial, LK477. He crouched, eased the ear toward the lamp, and read it again. The old, clean click of recognition ran through him. Working dogs, military, police, customs are cataloged the way important tools are cataloged. It wasn't a pet tattoo. It was a service mark. "Righto, mate," he said softly. "Now we're getting somewhere." He wiped his hands, crossed to the phone on the wall, and thumbed through a paper list with numbers collected over years of long drives and longer jobs. He stopped at a name he hadn't said aloud since a cyclone had peeled roofs like tin lids. Peter Lawson. In those days, Pete had been a sergeant in a K-9 unit, seconded to disaster response. A big man with a bricklayer's build and a careful way with his voice. Dark Irish hair gone iron gray at the temples. A jaw shadow that arrived by midday, no matter what he did with a razor. And an old rugby knee that made stairs a negotiation. Off-duty, he'd been the sort who'd carry the esky and listen more than he spoke. On duty, he had a reputation for teaching rookies that gentleness was faster. Pete picked up on the fourth ring with a "Yeah, Lawson" that sounded like a bloke halfway between paperwork and a meat pie. Jack gave him the short version. Upper Peninsula, a shepherd stray with a line like a sentry, and a dig that wouldn't quit. The find in the paddock, the recorder, the tape, and now the tattoo. LK477, Pete repeated, and Jack could hear the sound of a keyboard in the background. "Hang on. We kept a database when they rehomed the retirees. Half of it ended up on a flash drive, and the other half in my top drawer under a bag of minties. Here we go. Lucas, male, sable coat, trending gray, born 2018, explosive detection dog, 2 tours attached to engineers. Medically retired 21 after an IED. Blast made him jumpy of crowds and sharp noises. Handler went civvy. Dog sent to a rehab program. Good notes for drive and focus. Poor on kennels? Would need a quiet home. If that's your bloke, he's a Rolls Royce with a flat tire. Still, the best bits are all there." The words arrived like a wooden floor underfoot after a week of mud. "That explains the digging," Jack said, "and the way he holds a line." Pete's voice softened. "Explosives converts to anomaly for those dogs. They don't always know what the target is, only that the world is wrong in that spot. Don't push him hard. He'll run himself down to bone if you let him. And Jack, be ready for the dreams. Those dogs remember things in their sleep." Jack thanked him, sat with the receiver in his hand after the click, and looked at Scout with a new kind of respect that had nothing to do with pity. "Lucas?" he tried quietly. The dog's ear flicked, just once, as if answering to a name carried on a cold wind from far away. Business now. Jack called the county and asked for the sheriff. Hank Thompson came on the line after a moment of static that sounded like distance turning itself down. If you had to draw a sheriff out of memory, you might draw Hank. Late 50s, square through the shoulders, mustache gone the color of winter grass, lines at the corners of his eyes set there by nighttime conversations on front steps. He was the sort of man who ironed his shirts without fuss and kept a pair of old runners under his desk for days that ran long. 30 years in the job had taught him to speak plainly and leave space after questions. "Sheriff Thompson," he said. "Jack Monroe. I'm out past Pine Creek Road. I've found what I believe to be a buried ambulance and human remains on my block. I've secured the site. I also have personal effects of the deceased, including an ID, Sarah Hayes, and a tape recording from October '95 naming a Frank Creed. I can bring the items to you or you can come to me." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was the sound of a man rearranging his afternoon. "Stay put, Mr. Monroe," Hank said. "Don't touch anything else. I'll send a patrol to sit on your gate and I'll be there within the hour." He arrived with a deputy who looked all of 27 with a weathered baseball cap, where his hat should have been, and freckles across the bridge of his nose like a reminder that some people get to keep their childhoods. Hank himself stepped out of the cruiser in a tan jacket that had seen winters, the face of a man who knows both how to knock softly and how to knock loud. Up close you could see the hands, broad, blunt-fingered, nicked by work not as recent as he'd like, wedding band plain and scuffed. He spoke to Jack the way a paramedic speaks to someone who's already done the right thing. No theater, no questions with answers in them, no attempts to own the room. They walked in measured silence, to the kitchen. Jack didn't press play. He let Hank decide. The sheriff listened to the tape from the first hiss to the last click, standing with his arms loose at his sides as if bracing makes truth arrive any faster. When Sarah's final words cut off, he let out a breath through his nose and looked at the cufflink for a long second, the way you look at a thing that ought to be an answer and is only a doorway. "All right," he said. "I'll log evidence and get the coroner to the scene. I'll take this to the prosecutor and seek a warrant." He left with the items in proper bags the deputy had fished from a kit, the deputy taking the driveway like it was carrying something fragile, and the sheriff pausing on the porch to scratch Scout's head without trying to make friends. "Good dog," he said in the careful voice men use when they mean it. Jack slept the way people sleep after long days, hard, then surface, then hard again. In the morning, frost had stitched the edges of the paddock, and the ambulance sat under a gray tarp like a secret with manners. The call from Hank came before Smoko. He didn't ease into it. "They've put me on ice," he said, voice flat as a country road. "I presented the tape, the ID, your statement, and requested a warrant for Creed's place. The DA wants more substantial corroboration. He used the phrase, pillar of the community. He told me not to ruin a man's name with old stories and a stray's behavior." The last phrase had a taste in it. Jack pinched the bridge of his nose and let the anger come and go like a squall. "So we wait?" "For now," Hank said. "I'll keep pressing in the proper lanes. You keep your gate shut and your head down. And Mr. Monroe. Don't talk about this at the pub. He has ears everywhere." The line clicked. Jack stood at the window and watched Scout, Lucas, shift his weight and look to the paddock like a man glances at a stove he knows he left on. The house made a small, approving creak in the cold. "Righto," Jack told the room. "We'll be patient, for now." The day after the sheriff's call, the sky sat low and pewter again, and Jack took the county road into town, with Scout asleep in the passenger footwell like a shadow that had learned to breathe. He'd rung ahead and asked for a short visit, no fuss. Emily Hayes lived in a weatherboard cottage on a quiet street with maples that had gone to rust overnight, the kind of place where the letterbox leans, but the front steps are always swept. She opened the door with the polite caution of someone who's learned to measure faces before words. Late 50s, compact and tidy, she wore her grief the way some women wear a cardigan. Close, practical, never far from hand. Gray threaded through a careful bob. Her eyes were the same shape as the ghost on the license, but time had traded brightness for a steady, undramatic courage. A small scar nicked the ridge of one knuckle, domestic and old, the sort you get breaking a jar on a hurried morning. She had the voice of a school office manager who could settle a room with a look. "You must be Mr. Monroe," she said, standing back so he could step into the hall that smelled faintly of lemon oil and clean laundry. "Call me Emily. Tea?" "Wouldn't say no," Jack answered, minding his boots on the mat. Scout stayed at the threshold under a watchful set, tail still, eyes tracking for any quick movement like a sentry trained by a long winter. On the mantel in a neat lounge room sat an array of photographs. Weddings, Christmases, a boy in a baseball uniform that didn't fit yet, and a framed portrait of a young woman with light hair pulled back, smiling into someone else's future. Emily set 2 mugs and a plate of shortbread on the low table and sat with a straight back that made the cushions unnecessary. She had brought a small velvet box with her and rested her hand on it as if it might startle. "When Sarah went missing," she began without preamble, "Mum kept her room like a church until she couldn't bear it and packed everything into 3 boxes. We found this in the pocket of a jacket. She never took them off, those earrings, except to scrub or sleep. Silver hummingbirds. Our parents gave them to her when she finished nursing school. One of them went missing the week she... Well." Emily opened the box and lifted a single stud. It was small and worn, wings outstretched, the kind of jewelry given for hope rather than show. She came home one afternoon cross as a cut snake, told me she'd had a blazing row with Frank Creed out at his family's old storage shed. Said she'd lost the other hummingbird somewhere between the barn and the car. She was more upset about that than anything, which in hindsight tells you a lot about Sarah. Jack turned the earring in his fingers. It felt heavier than it looked, as keepsakes do. "That shed still standing?" "Just. On the outer edge of the old Blackwood property, now Mr. Creed's. We used to play there as kids. I wouldn't go out there by myself now." Her mouth made a small line. "I told the deputy back in '95, you know? He wrote it down." "I know," Jack said gently. "And I'm listening." Emily lifted her mug, then set it down again without drinking. If you find anything, you'll give it to the sheriff." "Straight away," Jack said. He meant it as a promise, not a performance. On the way out, he thanked her for the shortbread and for trusting the day with old pain. She put a hand on his sleeve, dry and warm. "Mr. Monroe," she said, an edge of steel under the softness. "Men like him count on good people getting tired." "I don't tire easy," he said. "Neither did my sister," she answered, and closed the door. Scout slept most of the drive back, chin on the toe of Jack's boot, the ear with the faded ink angled to catch whatever mattered. At the first bend of the farm track, Jack slowed and let the ute roll in quiet. He walked the paddock once, eyes on the tree line, and then fed Scout, who made quick work of the water but left half the food for later the way working dogs ration by instinct. They sat out the afternoon like 2 blokes on smoko planning the next job. When dark took the last of the field, Jack put on his quiet boots and a dark jacket that didn't catch light. He checked the torch, pocketed a small pry bar and a flathead, and slung the metal detector because hope is stubborn. Scout stood the way he always did when work was the point. Ears forward, tail still, body lined up like a tool laid ready on a bench. They left the ute a good walk from the old Blackwood shed and approached through pines that sighed in the cold. The building loomed up out of the dark, a big-boned barn with a corrugated skin, roof ridged like a knuckled fist, the kind of structure that looked close to collapse until you looked harder and realized it had been threatening to fall in for 30 years without obliging anyone. A rusted chain hung across the big doors, padlock old and theatrical. Jack put the torch between his teeth, eased the flathead into the hasp's gap, and lifted just enough to slide the chain off its lazy bracket. No noise that would bring a curious ear. Inside, dust and mouse stink, and the sweet ghost of old hay. He let the torch sit low and diffuse, no hot beam to paint a target. Scout's nose went to the plank floor and began a methodical pattern, not the aimless sniff of a pet, but a tight grid that wasted nothing. The detector, on the other hand, was immediately narky, chatter and peeps, a carnival of rubbish. Old bolts underfoot, tin offcuts, nails by the fistful, a shallow sea of small lies. Jack worked a slow sweep all the same, listening for a tone that held instead of flickered, but the machine was like a radio tuned between stations, all static and promise. "No joy," he whispered. Scout didn't need the commentary. He was already at the back corner, head canted, breathing a slow, careful cadence. Hythe stopped dead at a stack of rotten tarps that looked as if they'd collapse if you gave them a name. He flicked Jack a look, just one, then pawed once at the floorboard, not digging, just marking. Jack kneeled, pressed an ear to the plank to feel for hollowness, then got the pry bar in at the tongue. The wood complained in a long, cranky creak and lifted, splinters catching his palm. He laid the board aside, then another, until a shallow crawl space opened. A mean gap filled with a drift of dirt, glass grit, and the long exhale of years. The air tasted faintly of perfume, not fresh, but tenacious, the way smells cling to clothes kept in drawers too long. He lowered the torch and saw the remnants of a small glass bottle, broken and dulled, and, half hidden in shadow, something that winked dully, as if offended by dust. He reached in with 2 fingers and pinched it free. A silver hummingbird, wings out, the post bent but present. He thumbed the dirt away and lifted it into the torch's soft cone. "Got you," he breathed. Scout's tail made a single slow beat against the boards, the sound of a professional allowing himself one note of approval. Jack wrapped the stud in a clean handkerchief and tucked it into an inside pocket that closed, then replaced the boards the best he could, nothing showy, just enough to leave the room behaved. Outside, the pines moved like the sea. He lowered the chain across the door again and made sure the lock looked unbothered. They took a longer path back, cutting wide into the weeded verge of the track. Halfway to the ute, Scout stiffened, the change so clean it felt like a switch. He faced downhill toward a darker wedge of trees and held still until you could have sworn he was part of the earth. Jack couldn't hear the thing that caused it, but he read it in the dog's body and filed the knowledge. Someone else had walked this way today. Heavy boots, a smoker's cough on the air, or just the memory of one. The next morning, Jack shaved, put on a clean check shirt, and walked into the Sawmill Cafe at the easy side of lunch. The Sawmill had the look of every country cafe that had survived 3 owners and a health inspection. Vinyl seats patched with tape, a pie warmer that always had one last pepper steak hanging on, and a blackboard that promised proper coffee, and delivered exactly that. The owner, Dolly Kern, late 40s, broad through the shoulders and cheerful in the way people are when they've decided to be, had a plait the color of honey and forearms that could lift a flour sack without commentary. She ran the place like a good halfback, eyes everywhere, voice quick, a laugh that rose fast and cut off clean. Jack took a stool at the counter and ordered a flat white and a wedge of whatever cake had the most icing. At the back table sat a man who read groundskeepers from half a paddock away, mid-40s gone heavy, hair cropped close, hands too clean for a fencer, wearing a jacket with a little stitched spruce emblem over the pocket. The Creed Estate logo, if you'd been paying attention on the main road. His name, according to Dolly when she brought the cake, was Jerry Pike. "Does odd jobs up at the big house?" she said, not lowering her voice much because Dolly believed in daylight. "Keeps to himself, eats like it's a race." Jerry had the look of a bloke who'd tell you a story with the middle missing and expect you not to notice. Jack took out his phone and dialed a number he knew would ring through to nobody, his old prepaid still in a drawer for emergencies, and put it to his ear. "Hank," he said in a voice pitched for the room, "it's Jack Monroe. I've been thinking about that old Blackwood shed. I might take my detector out there tomorrow night. See if I can scare up that earring the sister mentioned. Long shot, but worth a go. No, I won't make a fuss. I'll be alone. Don't trouble yourself. Righto then. He ended the call, put a few notes under the saucer, and thanked Dolly for the cake, which he'd barely touched. As he stood, Jerry's eyes slid across him like a level checking a line. Reckon it's going to snow, Jerry said to no one, but to Jack. Reckon you're right, Jack said, and pushed through the door into a cold that felt instructional. He drove home the long way, taking the back road past a stand of birch that made a clean white line against the darker hills. Scout met him at the steps, and Jack scratched the scarred ear in greeting. Tomorrow night, he said to the dog, which was a truth and also not. He'd given the bait enough scent to travel. He wasn't going to be where the bait said he'd be. That evening he wrapped the hummingbird in a second handkerchief and laid it beside the recorder on the table, as if the two small things could talk to each other across time. He wrote 3 lines on the scrap under the fridge magnet. Emily's clue solid. Earring recovered from shed floor void. Word planted at sawmill for tomorrow night. He slept the way you do before a job. Light, face to the door, boots pointed the right way for a quick step. By late Arvo, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the air had that metallic edge that tells you snow's thinking about it. Jack Monroe parked the ute a paddock away from the old Blackwood shed and walked in through the pines with Scout at heel, the dog moving like a shadow that had learned discipline, ears forward, tail still, body lined up like a tool put back exactly where it belongs. Sheriff Hank Thompson had chosen his ground the way careful men do. 2 cruisers sat dark and quiet behind a windbreak of spruce, light bars hooded, engines cold. Further back, a state sedan wore the dust of a long week and the anonymity of government gray. Thompson himself, broad-shouldered, mustache the color of winter grass, eyes with the tired kindness of a man who's knocked on too many doors, stood in a weathered canvas coat with his hands deep in the pockets, talking in low tones to 2 deputies. Deputy Lena Cho, early 30s, hair in a no-nonsense plait under her cap, had the compact build of a runner and that calm, even look you see in good triage nurses. Deputy Walt Kenshaw, early 40s, freckled and square in the jaw with a day's ginger stubble and a battered wedding ring, had the stance of a bloke who says little and means most of it. Both wore body cams that winked a dull red under their jackets. "Evening," Hank said without theater. "You weren't wrong about bait working. Words come back through 2 channels that Mr. Creed is restless." His mouth made a line that wasn't a smile. "He doesn't like loose ends." Jack nodded once. "Neither do I." He opened his palm to show the small digital recorder he'd brought from home, already rolling. The sheriff nodded. Chain of custody habits go deep, and gestured to Kenshaw, who clicked his own audio on. "You 2 inside," Hank told Jack and Scout. "Lights off. Don't try to be heroes. If he swings, step back and let us earn our pay." He looked at Scout for a long half-second, weighing the dog the way you weigh a tool. Not whether it's pretty, but whether it's fit for purpose. "And you, mate? No biting unless life's on the line. We don't need a civil suit on top of everything." The corner of Jack's mouth ticked. "He's a Rolls-Royce with a flat tire, Sheriff. All the best bits are still there, but he won't move unless the job says so." Thompson's eyebrows tipped in what passed for approval. "Righto then. On you go." Inside, the shed held the same stale perfume of dust and old hay, the plank floor keeping its secrets with the stubbornness of bush timber. Jack eased the chain back across the doors the way he'd found it, and set himself 10 paces in, torch tucked in a pocket and switched off. Pry bar laid on a crate where his hand could find it without looking. Scout slid into the dark beside a stack of tarps, nose near the boards, body coiled but quiet. Out beyond the walls, the world thinned to simple elements. The sough of wind. Through spruce combs, a far-off owl doing the old call and answer. The small tick of metal as a cooling engine gave up its heat to the cold. When headlights finally washed a pale stripe through gaps in the cladding, Jack felt his heart do the sensible thing. One hard thump, and then a settling, while Scout lifted his head in a motion you could have timed with a metronome. Tires crunched on frozen gravel. A door opened with the easy confidence of a man who believes the world will always pause for his entrance. Frank Creed stepped into the doorway with a torch in one hand and a tire iron in the other, the beam carving white wedges through dust. He was older than the newspaper photos by a decade, and 1,000 bad choices. Early 70s, tall and carefully kept, silver hair disciplined into a part. Face still handsome in the way money can purchase time, but the mouth meaner now, the eyes too quick. He wore a dark wool coat that would have read taste in better company, leather gloves that creaked when he tightened his grip, and an aftershave sharp enough to register even over mouse stink. "Monroe," he said, because men like him always know names. "You've been a nuisance." His voice had that clubroom warmth that can turn to ice before the sentence ends. "You think you can dig around on my property, steal from me, slander me in cafes?" Jack could taste the arrogance like old smoke. He kept his hands visible and his voice low, as if discussing fence lines. "You came to tidy up, did you, Frank? Funny thing about untidy rooms, sometimes they're evidence." The tire iron lifted a fraction. "You don't get to call me by my first name." Scout's chest swelled once and released, a silent warning like the first surge of a rip. Creed took 2 slow steps farther in. He angled the torch so the beam sat hard on Jack's face, trying to make the other man blink, then swung the tire iron through a small testing arc that made the air huff. "Where is it?" he asked, and the veneer cracked enough for heat to come through. "Where is the other earring?" The words were admission wearing a mask. The shed changed temperature in the space between one breath and the next. Floodlights detonated white across the doorway and spread shadows across the floorboards like dropped flags. "Sheriff's office?" Hank's voice cracked the room cleanly, all daylight now. "Frank Creed, drop the tool and put your hands where I can see them." Creed froze the way snakes do, still but thinking fast. Then the anger came up and over like an old tide, and he raised the iron a half-meter in a stupid, ancient motion. "Don't," Jack said, because the body sometimes listens when the brain won't. Scout was a line of muscle set to stone, teeth still hidden, whole being asking for permission to act. Kenshaw moved first, neat and quick, the way men who have learned to tackle at waist height do. The tire iron clanged to boards and skittered under, a mower deck with the petty artistry of dropped things. Lena had Creed's wrist hinged in a moment, the kind of joint control that speaks of training and respect for bones, not bravado. Hank stepped into the cone of light, weapon at a low ready, body cam catching each second. "Hands behind," he said, voice all iron now. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault and suspicion of interfering with an active crime scene. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The cuffs clicked with a tired finality. Creed tried for indignation, the coat, the hair, the torch beam theater. "This is outrageous. Do you know who I am?" "A bloke in handcuffs," Kenshaw said in the flat tone of someone who's done night shifts in bad weather. "That's who you are right this minute." Lena bagged the tire iron, tagged the chain, and swept the beam of her torch across the boards with the careful habit of officers who know defense solicitors get paid by the doubt. Hank looked to Jack. "You all right?" "Good," Jack said. He was too, in the specific way that means you haven't lied to yourself in the last 5 minutes. Scout let the breath go and eased from coiled to ready, then to calm. He kept his distance from Creed, a professional refusing to give a fool the satisfaction of fear. Outside, cold air bit the lungs clean. They walked Creed to the cruiser without spectacle. No one spoke in the first minute, because sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps a scene honest. At the cars, Creed found his tongue. "This is harassment. I was checking on my property. This is entrapment." Hank didn't bother to turn. "It's lawful to be where you are lawfully allowed to be, Mr. Creed. Tampering with a site after lawful notice from law enforcement? Not so much." He slid the man into the back seat in a single smooth motion and shut the door with a click that sounded like a full stop. Back at the small interview room in town, cinder block walls, a table that had seen coffee rings and confessions, a clock that ticked just loud enough to be noticed, Hank and Lena ran it by the book. Body cams off, room camera on, Miranda read again. A recorder the size of a cigarette packet blinked its red dot. Creed demanded a solicitor. Hank rang the on-call, a man named Barry Quick, late 50s, tidy beard, spectacles that made him look kinder than he felt, who arrived with the air of someone whose hourly rate could be smelled before he sat. Quick had neat hands and a voice like a clean cut, all "with respect, Sheriff," while his eyes said other things. He put a palm on Creed's forearm and murmured in the confidential tone of a man explaining interest rates to a child. Even so, pride is a poor leash. When Hank, patient and careful, placed on the table a clear bag with the recovered hummingbird stud, and another with the cufflink, and a printout still of a driver's license that carried a smile the room could not hold, Creed couldn't help himself. "That earring proves nothing," he said. And then, like a man tripping over his own certainty, "She dropped it when she—" Quick's hand lifted, a surgeon catching a slip. "When she what, Mr. Creed?" Hank asked, tone mild as a weather report. Creed's mouth worked, the mask poorly fitted now. "When she made a scene," he said finally, but the words had lost their jacket and tie. Hank pressed play on a copy of the 1995 tape and let Sarah Hayes speak for herself. The room tightened as the last click fell. Quick shifted in his chair. "We'll be making no further statements," he said, "which is what you say when the ground under your client has turned from clay to slurry." Yet in the half hour that followed, waiting on paperwork, coffee on the way, snow beginning to pelt the window in small, dry flakes, Creed couldn't sit inside his own silence. The words came out in mean, bitter drabs, not enough for poetry, more than enough for a jury. "She wanted to ruin me. She wouldn't let it go. My family's name." Each phrase landed on the recorder like a nail tapped true. Hank didn't gloat. He didn't lean in. He just let the tape do its slow work and made sure the clock was in frame. Near midnight, with the earring secured, the iron bagged, and Creed logged for transfer, Jack stepped back into the kind of cold that trims away everything but truth. Scout jumped into the ute with the practiced movement of a dog who had slept in worse places and found peace anyway. Hank came to the curb with his coat collar up and a nod that cost him a little. "Good work," he said simply. "We've got enough to push the DA past his manners." Jack glanced at the dog and then at the sheriff. "It's not a win," he said. "Not yet, but it's a start." "Starts are what we get," Hank said. "Finishes are for juries and families." They shook hands without ceremony. On the way out of town, Jack stopped at a servo for a pie and a bottle of water, because food after adrenaline is medicine. Scout got the crust, as mates do. The road home was a ribbon of dark cut by the ute's low beams, and the paddocks slept under a new skiff of white. Back at the farmhouse, Jack wrote 3 lines under the fridge magnet. "Trap sprung. Creed arrested. Earring, tape, admissions on record, and stood for a long moment with his hand on the back of a chair, feeling the house agree with him in its small timber creaks. He wasn't happy. He was steady. Some nights that's the better thing. The storm that had dusted the paddocks through the night broke into a clean, pale morning, and the world outside Jack Monroe's kitchen window looked scrubbed. Birch trunks white as chalk lines, the barn roof wearing a thin cap of sugar, the old ruts on the track softened into gentle curves. Paperwork had a way of stretching out the end of a hard week, but by late morning Sheriff Hank Thompson rang to say the prosecutor was satisfied with the forensic copies and certified stills. Personal effects not essential to trial could, with a signed release, go back to family. Hank arrived with a clipboard and the careful, unhurried manner of a man who refused to let relief turn into sloppiness. Up close, the sheriff looked a little older than he had yesterday, the kind of tired you only see when a weight has shifted off a man's shoulders. His mustache still ran the color of winter grass. His eyes had the red thread that comes from too many coffees and not enough dark. He set the microcassette in a padded sleeve, and the hummingbird stud in a slim evidence box with foam cutouts, watched Jack sign where he pointed, and then stood a beat longer than necessary, reading the quiet of the kitchen as if it were print. "You did good, mate," he said, the accent sitting faintly in the vowels like a familiar hat hung by the door. "We'll carry it from here. DA's got his more substantial corroboration, and a bloke named Creed's solicitor is suddenly very keen on bargains." He scratched Scout between the ears. The dog, big, spare, 3 to 4 years of life carved into posture rather than fat, that nick on the left ear like punctuation, accepted the touch without leaning in, the way professionals do. Jack packed the tape and the earring into a small timber box he'd planed himself in the shed, while snow ticked at the roof. American walnut top, pine sides from old barn boards, dovetails a touch proud because he liked knowing where the joints were. He lined it with a square of clean tea towel and wrote Emily in pencil under the lid, where only wood and time would see it. The drive into town felt different now, the Utes heater doing its humble best, and the day holding its sunlight in a careful hand. On the passenger side footwell, Scout settled into his usual curl, chin resting on the toe of Jack's boot, as if proximity could soft-wire trust. Emily Hayes met him at the weatherboard with the same tidy dignity as before. Late 50s, compact frame, gray threaded through a neat bob, cardigan buttoned because some habits were about respect, not temperature. She had moved like a woman who learned long ago how to carry grief without spilling it on the floor. Today there was something else under her eyes, a lay of tiredness that wasn't defeat, so much as the end of a bracing breath held too long. The front room still smelt faintly of lemon oil and washing powder, the mantel still arranged around the framed photo of a young nurse whose smile made, "You believe in uncomplicated futures." Jack set the box on the coffee table, walnut top catching the low winter light, and eased the lid back. Emily's fingers were square-tipped and practical, the nails short, faint paint worn thin. She handled the cassette like a fragile thing you also want to hear, again and again. The earring lay on the cotton like a small bird that had folded its wings. For a long moment, Emily said nothing, the way people do when words would be a lesser instrument. Then she lifted the hummingbird and cupped it in the center of her palm, as if she were measuring weight against memory. "Dad always said hope had wings," she murmured. "Mum thought that was sentimental rubbish, but she cried when he gave Sarah these. Thank you." She put the earring back and reached across the short space to cover Jack's hand with hers. Warm, papery, strong. "You didn't just find things," she said, voice growing rough around the edges. "You restored the last few minutes of her life, and that's..." That's a kind of kindness I don't have words for. He told her there would be court days and statements and impatient forms, that Sheriff Thompson had promised to sit with her through each of them, and that nothing owed to Sarah would be rushed into the ground. She nodded, breathed once like a swimmer breaking the surface, and smiled in a way that put new lines in places where only worry had lived. In the doorway, Scout sat with absolute manners, body still, head high, the pale inside of his left ear catching a bar of light. "He's beautiful," Emily said, and then laughed through her nose at herself. "Can a dog be beautiful? He looks like he knows exactly what he's for." Jack scratched the scarred ear. "Lucas, they called him once," he said, testing how the name felt in a friend's house. The ear flick answered. Scout now. He chose the work and then chose to stay. On the way home, the sun sharpened just enough to put a glint on every ice edge along the fence wire. The county had filled the trench weeks earlier with clean soil and seed. Under the light snow, it made a darker rectangle in the paddock, a bruise fading in honest weather. Jack walked out with a bucket in one hand and a handful of seed in the other, scattering rye and clover in a loose, generous arc, and Scout paced beside him at the polite distance of a partner not wishing to crowd. Over the next month, winter loosened its jaw. The pines stopped playing their high-wire song, the birches shook out 100 soft flags, and the square in the field shifted from brown to a brand-new green that looked almost shy among the old growth. Jack sanded the porch rail where the ice had gnawed it and patched the barn door where a hinge had been costing him sleep. Scout made small rounds, nose low, sometimes pausing to watch the whole turned rectangle as if checking on a patient. On the first true warm afternoon, he took Scout to the vet for a proper once-over. Dr. Mara Jensen had the easy competence that makes nervous creatures breathe better, early 40s, willowy and long-boned, red hair coiled into a messy knot that never fell down, freckles standing out on summer-brown skin, hands with clean nails, and a gold ring that declared marriage without declaring anything else. She had the voice of a country GP, warm but never woolly, precise without being prissy. "K9, hey," she said, peeling a bandage off one paw pad with the kind of attention you give to small jobs that matter. "Pads are chafed, not torn. We'll boot him on rough ground until they toughen again. Teeth good, hips smooth, heart like a metronome. He'll need quiet when the weather gets noisy, storms, fireworks, but you know that already." Scout stood on the table with the stoicism of an old stock horse, eyes doing the fine arithmetic of the room. "You're the sensible one," Mara told him, and handed Jack a jar of pad balm and a practical list. Short walks, brain work, a bed in a corner where nobody had to pass too close. In the servo on the way home, Jack bought a bag of tennis balls and laughed at himself for being cliché. Scout took one in his mouth and carried it out like a modest prize. The idea for hands and paws arrived the way good ideas often do. Part joke, part itch, then suddenly unavoidable. It came in the cafe over a flat white where Dolly Kern leaned on the counter and said, "There's a possum in Mrs. Dugan's roof and no one in council will touch it, love." And in Rusty Calhoun's hire yard when the old bloke muttered, "Found a Kelpie cross dumped by the quarry again, bloody mongrels," while he tied down a mower on a trailer, and in a quiet chat out behind the courthouse where Hank said, "There are families who need steady hands to hold a torch while they look in old places." Jack put up a small notice on the library board, hands and paws, quiet rescues, gentle searches, call or leave a note. And he didn't wait for a committee or a grant. People arrived instead. Finn O'Leary turned up first, a 17-year-old string bean in an old footy hoodie, hair the color of wet straw, and a starburst of pale freckles across his nose. He had the eager, respectful energy of a kid who's made a couple of wrong turns and decided to go straight by working hard. He listened like a sponge and drove like a man who knew the value of brakes. Pastor Ruth Delgado came next from the little church by the mill pond, early 50s, short and wiry, hair black and clipped close, hands that had held more casseroles and midnight hands than she could count. Her voice could quiet a room or fill it with the same gentle authority, and she knew which forms in which drawers opened, which doors for people with poor luck. Rusty donated old crates and a pair of folding ramps with the offhand gruffness of a man who prefers deeds to speeches. May Rourke, who delivered the mini excavator like it was a song she knew by heart, started texting when she saw animals on roads, and taught Finn how to throw a tie-down right the first time. Dr. Mara agreed to triage after hours, no fuss, and had spare slip leads hanging on a peg by her back door with a sign that said, "Take what you need. Bring back what you can." Their first job was a Kelpie lab mix trapped in a culvert behind a farmhouse where a fence line had collected half a season's worth of leaf litter. The farmer, Walt Ashby, a blocky 60-year-old with a face like an unpainted fence post, deep-etched smile lines, and a habit of apologizing to animals as if they were neighbors, stood wringing a cap in both hands while Jack assessed angles. Scout lay at the culvert mouth and made a soft, confident huff that wasn't quite a bark. Inside, the dog answered with a small, desperate whimper. Finn belly-crawled through the mud with a slip lead and a piece of sausage. Pastor Ruth talked to the dog like it was a frightened child. Jack dug out the last of the wedge with a trenching shovel. Scout kept his body exactly where the other dog could see him without feeling crowded. 10 minutes later, a muddy, shivering animal with one ear inside out sat shaking on the grass, while Mara wrapped it in a towel and Rusty muttered that whoever dumped it wanted a good long talk with a fence post and a paddock. It wasn't much in the ledger of the world, but when the Kelpie's tail ticked twice against Finn's knee, Jack felt something unclench behind his ribs like a shirt button finally giving up an old fight. A week after that, they took a call from a daughter whose mum had been gone a long time. The police had done their good work and come up empty. The family needed help with a search on private land that had a dozen awkward corners. Hands and Paws didn't promise miracles. They promised to walk slow, hold torches steady, and listen. They mapped old sheds, flagged sinkholes, worked politely alongside law enforcement. They didn't find the woman that day. They found the enameled brooch she'd worn to church every week for 30 years, the one her family thought must have been lost somewhere else. And the daughter cried in the kind of way that cleans you out and fills you up again. Jack wrote up their small wins and quiet misses on a clipboard in the kitchen under a magnet that had once held shopping lists. Possum rehoused, Kelpie fostered, brooch returned. Scout slept under the table with one paw over a tennis ball, the ink in his ear a faded address for a previous life that had found a forwarding number at last. By the time spring got properly into its stride, the rectangle in the paddock had gone from new green to ordinary green, which is a kind of miracle all on its own. Jack sat on the porch of an evening with a cuppa that steamed in the last light and watched the field take its breath. Beside him, Scout leaned his head into Jack's thigh in an old soldier's version of cuddle. No drama, all trust. There would be court, dates and press, and people who wanted to own the story. There would be more calls and culverts and old sheds that coughed up small truths. There would be nights when weather rattled the windows, and Scout needed a hand on his ribs until dreams let go. But the house seemed to accept them now, with its modest creaks and the way it warned of wind a moment before it arrived. And if you listened to the place closely, you could hear what a home says when it decides you belong. It says nothing at all and makes room. Hands and Paws never had a mission statement beyond what the name carried, but the work took a shape of its own. Quiet, practical, decent. two creatures left behind had found an edge to stand on together and discovered it wasn't the edge at all. Before we say goodnight, a quick word from the porch. Not every miracle arrives with thunder. Most come in work boots and muddy paws, showing up right where our everyday lives are, at the grocery line, the school pickup, the doctor's waiting room. I believe God still sends helpers, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, to nudge us toward the light. If this story reminded you that hope still walks the earth, would you share it with a friend who needs it? Drop your own everyday miracle in the comments. I read them, and so does this little community. And if you'd like, type pray or leave a, and we'll lift your name up this week. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next story of grace in plain clothes. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you peace over your home, your health, and your heart. God bless you, and God bless all who watch.